Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, one decade, the 60s. Let's begin with a little history quiz. What's 3.5 inches by 2.25 inches and divided an entire generation of Americans? Here's a hint. Every American male between the ages of 18 and 35 was required by law to have one in his possession. A draft card. Hundreds of thousands of the young men who obeyed the law and honored this card found themselves shipped overseas and ended up carrying one of these. Hundreds of thousands of other young Americans disobeyed the law. Many burned their draft cards. They stayed home, or in some cases went north to Canada, and many of them ended up carrying one of these. The Vietnam War protest movement often turned violent. On college campuses across the country, administration buildings were occupied, trashed, even burned. At the same time, though, there was another protest movement taking place, one that was generally peaceful, the civil rights movement. Two enormous protest movements, the after effects of which continue to shape American life even today. Our guests, Christopher Hitchens, a contributing editor to Vanity Fair magazine, and William F. Buckley Jr., editor-at-large of National Review magazine. As young men during the 60s, Hitchens and Buckley took opposite sides. And today, 30 years later, they look back on the left and the right. You were in Chicago during the Democratic Convention of 1968, and you wrote afterwards, quote, "Chicago was seething with tension. What my wife and I had heard 14 stories high in our hotel was F. LBJ, F. Mayor Daley." Now, just 15 years before, the Korean War had taken place without protest. What had changed?
Well, there were, to begin with, a few tripwires. The assassination of Kennedy, then the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and of Martin Luther King, so that the atmosphere was certainly getting very tense. That exploded in conjunction with heightened hostilities on the whole Vietnam issue.
I'd add that perhaps beginning with the Warren Commission, which I agree was one of the tripwires, there had arisen, I suppose it happens in every generation, but I think it was very salient in this one, a belief that the government was lying, or rather the recognition, the shock of recognition that that was true, that the government would lie to you openly and blatantly and on a major thing. I think that was the big discovery of that year.
In 1968, when Mr. Buckley was in a hotel room listening to chants, you were in Cuba as an agricultural volunteer helping to plant coffee. Now, what I want to excavate here is, what on earth were you thinking? By the time one Englishman had arrived in Cuba, 1 million Cubans had fled. What were you thinking?
You were thinking to corner the coffee market.
Well, actually, it's true that...
were you a dedicated Marxist?
It's true they needed some coffee, and they still do, as a matter of fact. It's still rationed there, in spite of my best efforts. I was a dedicated Marxist. I was a member of an organization that was actually anti-Castroite organization. If you're really interested in my personal history, you have to get some sectarian minutiae in. It was a Luxembourgist Trotskyist organization, and we sent a delegation of people to see whether or not the Cuban Revolution was, as advertised, a break with the Soviet model, a new start, and all of that. And this was remembered shortly after the death of the much controverted Ernesto Che Guevara. And it was a very interesting time to be there, because I was there during the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was the point at which it became evident that Castroism was not going to live up to the advertised hopes. So
You were how old, Christopher?
I was then 19.
19, and you were in Oxford at that time?
I was at the end of my first year in Oxford. Yes.
Right. Now, what I'm interested in is to the extent to which your thinking was in some way representative of the thinking of your generation. That is to say, those protesters in Chicago, those people planting beans in Cuba, were you an outlier? Were you especially ideological? Or was there a hard ideological core?
But we felt, in our little corner of the left, that the great thing about 1968 was exactly that. Both of the Cold War camps were undergoing a convulsion, and our great hope was, which was disappointed, was for a convergence between those two things.
Your great hope as a as a member of this small the Trotskyite organization, or
Yes.
your great hope, your generation's great hope?
Well, I think this was held in common by a lot of people who were completely new to politics and quite naive about it.
Right. Well, Bill, as you read the kids who were in the street protesting, how much of it was relatively sophisticated ideology? They weren't just rejecting the straight-laced lives of their parents, but the whole notion, the whole Cold War notion that communism was bad, we were good. And how much of it was just kind of naivete, romanticization of the commies, and so on?
Well, you've asked the hard questions. I mean, the fact is that there was a kind of a listlessness in the 60s, and that listlessness called for a kind of a masturbatory relief. People wanted to find if they could go ahead and get their kicks in some way that they hadn't been getting them, and the more so if they could wed them to some ideal. In fact, what it was primarily self-concern and an attempt to cast a noble perspective on what it is that you were up to.
You were engaged in narcissism,
I think
Christopher?
I'll have to quarrel literally as well as metaphorically with Mr. Buckley's characterization of it as masturbatory. Actually, it was quite celebrated for going the distance. Perhaps one of the great things about it was that it was the first generation, or perhaps one of the less great things about it, but at any rate one of the true things about it, one of the first generations to take the separation of sex and procreation for granted, which I think led to a great deal of jealousy, incidentally, not to say envy, among preceding generations.
The pill came into wide use just about then.
I think it might be worth making a distinction between being, as it were, a 68er, or soixante huitard, as the more pretentious of us call ourselves, and a 60s person, because anyone born in the right boom bracket can claim to have been a 60s person. And the way it's all represented now retrospectively, airbrushed and rewritten, is beads, caftans, exactly as Mr. Buckley says, make love, not war, Woodstock Nation, all that. Now that was sort of common generationally, as common as, say, James Dean had been a bit earlier. But what we're talking about, I believe, is the 60s left. In other words, the attempt to block what we thought of, correctly in my view still, as an imperialist and aggressive and unjust war,